Greetings and salutations. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange and the host, who might be some sort of goblin creature. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual literature that I have found in my travels through Murmansk, which is in Russia. Today, I wanted to talk about a book that I read, a lovely book about goblins and fairies and the Russian mafia, and how do those things blend together? Well, we will find out. I am talking about Artemis Fowl, The Arctic Incident by Eoin Colfer. A lovely cover. I like it because this is the cover that the book that I read way back in high school had. And what bothers me is that they've since reprinted the book, and the covers now feature an Artemis Fowl cool teenager type, which might appeal to, those Gen Z kids. But for me, a millennial, I'm still partial to these. They're minimalistic, but they give you some idea of what to expect, which I'm guessing is like some sort of vault that they hold Artemis Fowl's father in, and how that comes together. I'll explain it in a bit. A while back, I talked about the first book where Artemis steals fairy technology, and it's basically just one big siege story, and it's pretty compelling and a lovely first book. I said around that time that I wanted to do a read-through of the series, much like what I'm doing with the Princess Diaries, although that's on hold, but I'll get to that very soon, sooner rather than later. So yeah, I wanted to talk about the Arctic incident, just because I wanted to see if it was good. Although the problem here is that when I was in high school, I didn't really think too strongly of this book. I felt it was a little boring, less fun than the first book, and certainly it doesn't compare to the third book, which I feel is a superior sequel to the first book. So I guess what I'm saying is I wanted to see if it was as bad as I remember, and what that means, I'll get to that in the analysis section of the video. So yeah, let's talk about it. I'll go through a little summary, a little analysis, and we will move on from there. The Arctic incident takes place a little bit after the events of the first book. So Artemis outsmarted the fairies, and he now has their fairy gold. What is he choosing to do with this fairy gold? What he's doing is that he's trying to locate his father, because his father was kidnapped by the Russian mafia years ago, and nobody's been really able to figure out where he's at, and his mother is distraught about it, and Artemis is really missing his father. Very nearly at the start of the story, Artemis gets a text, or sort of a video from an outside source, and it shows his father, and in Russian writing it says, "Hello, son." So it's indicative that the Russian is going to hold him ransom. Unfortunately, the butler points out that in cases of ransoming, the Russian mafia likes to, kill all parties involved so that nobody can come back for vengeance, or nobody can, rat them out to the police or anything like that. So Artemis is in a bit of a pinch. Meanwhile, Holly is dealing with a sort of a goblin uprising in Haven, in the underground city where all the fairies live, and all the goblins seem to have specific weaponry that isn't counterable by the fairies. And Holly, after the events of the first book, is still a little peeved that nothing got done about Artemis Fowl. And so she's like, oh, well, obviously they have a human conspirator. The goblins are working with Artemis Fowl. And despite the lack of evidence, they agree to let her go above ground and confront Artemis about this. Holly brings Artemis down to Haven, where she interrogates him, and Artemis just points out, I had nothing to do with this. Besides, you can't really take me in for anything because I outsmarted the fairies, and according to your rules, you can't do anything about that. But they eventually figure out that, there's a man in France who has been supplying the goblins with weapons. So they head to Paris to work together on this. And in exchange, the fairies promise that they'll help Artemis recapture his father. A little tit for tat. Both problems are solved. However, Opal Cowboy, who has been supplying weapons to the police and the goblins, and Briar Cudgeon, who is from the first book, he tried to do the siege at Artemis Fowl's house, and that did not go as planned. And so he's been embarrassed and a bit of a sort of like he's on the bad list right now with the fairy police. That's made him a bit upset, and so now he's working with Opal Kobe to really take over the police and get back in the good graces. And he also plans on getting rid of Opal Cowboy in the process, because she he views her as a little crazy, and as much as he would like to help her retain power, he wants power for himself more. She can't be around. He wants to get rid of all witnesses. So Artemis and Holly and Butler and Julius all travel to the Arctic. They're immediately attacked by goblins, and they realize that this was all a ruse to get them away from Haven so the goblins could rise up. And Foley, the centaur friend, who's sort of the communications dude, eventually figures out that Opal and Briar are responsible, and so he gets a message to Artemis and lets them know that who's responsible. They have a bit of difficulty figuring out how to get back down to Haven, and so they decide to turn to Mulch, who helped the fairies tunnel into Artemis Fowl's house in the first book. And Mulch is a little reluctant, but he agrees to help after Julius, threatens to beat him. And so, they tunnel into Cowboy Laboratories, where they're able to stop Briar Cudgeon and Opal Cowboy, and cease the Goblin Uprising in the process. So things are much more positive in that regard there. And true to the word, Holly and I think Julius go with Artemis and Butler to the ransom meetup in Russia, and through a bunch of nefarious means and outwitting the Russians, they managed to get Artemis's dad back. And the Russians, their ransom is fairy gold, which will kind of just melt away or just evaporate in about 72 hours. So that's not looking good for those people there. And that's about where the story ends, with Holly and Artemis parting ways. Artemis for the better, and Holly sort of losing her prejudice for the mud people, the humans as it is. And so they're on better terms there. Interestingly, they do not wipe Artemis's mind at this point. He still has knowledge of the fairies. So in terms of analysis, I would say this story is pretty good in terms of the character development that exists for Artemis Fowl, because at the start of the first book, Artemis is a little butthead who is using his genius for evil and outwits the fairies out of their gold. But eventually, he becomes softer over the course of the story. You learn that he's caring for his mother, and he wants to use his money to help his mom feel better, and he wants to use he becomes closer to Butler. He cares for people other than himself. And at the start of this story, Artemis has regressed a little bit in terms of not caring for others, but over the course of the story, he becomes closer with Holly. He comes to see her as an intellectual equal, which is rare because Artemis doesn't consider anyone his intellectual equal. And the story shows that he cares for other people more so than at the beginning of the first book, and that's a lot of development for Artemis. And I gotta say, it's good for this entire series, because it shows how Eoin Colfer is able to write somebody who's at a terrible, heinous place at the beginning and move them towards a better place in a believable way. It's not just Artemis is evil and then suddenly he's good. It takes time for him to get there through events like working with the fairies and needing the help of others rather than seeing himself as infallible and not needing to rely on others for assistance. And the biggest example of this, I think, is his apology to Holly at the end of the book, where after rescuing his father, they have a moment where they connect, where Holly is sort of losing that bias against the human beings, and sort of growing to love Artemis. And Artemis apologizes to Holly. He says, I'm sorry about, what happened at the manor. I'm sorry for kidnapping you. I'm sorry for using you to get gold. That was wrong. I understand that now. And that's a big moment for Artemis, because he was a piece of garbage during the first book, and for him to be able to say I'm sorry when he usually doesn't apologize is a big moment, and absolutely it was a pleasure to read that part. And I think along with that is Artemis and Holly. I mentioned their chemistry in the first book, how they play off against each other, and I think that works here too. Them becoming more like a brother and sister type who bicker and try to one up one another. I think it really works, and it's why I like this series so much, because that you have these two equally intelligent, equally powerful people who use their power in different ways. And both who refuse, they're very stubborn, headbutting at times, often on the same side of things, but still working together to improve any situation they find themselves in. However, there are a couple reasons why, or maybe just one main reason why I don't like this story as a whole. I feel like it's not a good story. I feel like Eoin Colfer had two different stories he wanted to write, but not enough material for each story. There's a story of the Goblin Uprising and the story of his father's rescue in Russia from the hands of the Mafia. And both would be fine stories on their own, but Eoin Colfer doesn't have enough, and so he devotes half of a book to each of the story. And it's weak, I feel. It makes it so the story doesn't have a lot of focus, and the villains of the story, the Russian mafia leaders and Opal Cowboy and Briar Cudgeon, they both appear weak. I understand Cudgeon wants his revenge, but he does it so ineffectually that it comes off like why did you even try? Our heroes are never really in any peril, and it weakens the story. I feel like this is the weakest part in the story. It's sandwiched between two greater stories, and I will get to Eternity Code at a later date, but Art Dickinson is sandwiched between a really good heist story and a really good siege story, and it can't meet up with any of them, and so it comes off very very weak, and not, the characters aren't as exciting, although it does help that there is character development on Artemis's part, and you have Eoin Colfer writing more about that chemistry between Holly and Artemis, as well as Butler, because Butler is a cool character throughout the series, and I'm glad the series has that character. It makes all the books worth reading, in my opinion. So as a result, because the story doesn't feel complete and the characters aren't really fleshed out and given a chance to shine, I feel like this story is very skippable. If you were reading the series, what you could do is you could read the first story, and then you could get a summary of the second story, which is Artemis Fowl and Holly and the Fairies work together to help Artemis rescue his father from the Russian mafia, while also helping the fairies in a goblin uprising, which makes the story sound a lot cooler than it is. It's nowhere near as good as that, but as long as you know that, and as long as you know that the fairies didn't wipe his mind after this incident, you can get a much better understanding of what happens in the third story, especially because it starts off with Artemis doing criminal deeds and showing that he hasn't fully matured, even though the second book would argue that he did. I think this is a very skippable story, and if you're reading them in order, just read one and then move on to three. while looking up a bit of a summary, so you might not be confused anytime the second story is brought up throughout the series. So overall, I would say that I enjoyed the story. I do think, again, I do think it's skippable, but it does have a lot of good bits. But I'm not gonna go out and recommend it to anyone. And it wouldn't make much sense if I did recommend it, because who's gonna read the second story before they've even read the first? That wouldn't make very much sense. So. It's a fine book, but it doesn't hold up to the other books in the series, especially the first book. It's a step down. If you think differently, if you read this book and you actually enjoyed it, or you want to say something about my review, feel free to comment below. I would love to hear from you and have a discussion about Artemis Fowl and the fairy people.